Welcome back to TACTCast, a production of the Tennessee Academy of Christian Thought.
Hey, Phil.
Hey, Cameron. How you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you?
Good. How's your day been?
All right. Not too bad. Can't complain. How about you?
It's going well. I teach high school.
Yeah, okay.
For now.
Yeah. More on that later.
Yeah.
So today got some interesting book we're gonna talk about.
Okay. What are we reading?
So John J. Collins' commentary on the book of Daniel.
Daniel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
That's a fun one.
It is a fun one. Originally, I had hoped to read the Collins commentary and compare that, which is a really hardcore sort of modern critical scholarship commentary, and compare that with another academic level commentary that I knew was much more had a traditional sort of interpretation, because I'm sure you're aware, Daniel is or the interpretation, dating, authorship of Daniel varies a lot, typically based upon creedal stance, perhaps we could say.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a good idea to break that down. So, as far as I understand, Daniel has almost like two sections that are written in different languages, right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's a really interesting, it's probably the most difficult book to interpret, date, these sorts of things in the Old Testament. It has two sections. Actually, it's three sections in two languages. So the first chapter is in Hebrew, and then chapters 2 through 7 Aramaic, and then which is a similar Semitic language, similar to Hebrew, and then 8 through 12 are again in Hebrew. So
Jesus spoke Aramaic.
He did speak Aramaic.
Yeah,
that's right. That was sort of a lingua franca. In other words, that was like the common language that people would speak in the Near East, ancient Near East, kind of like English today.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I have a question on
Okay.
something you just mentioned. So this is sort of scholarly style commentary.
Yeah.
So what differentiates a sort of scholarly commentary from sort of your standard commentary that you would read along with Scripture?
Oh, I see. Okay, so I mean, there are different types of commentaries. There are scholarly ones, as you say, and then there are more devotional-oriented ones. So a devotional-oriented commentary is the main point of those seems to be, if I read this as a believer, what does it mean for me and my life as a believer? Whereas a scholarly one tends to be, they're going to look at things like what are the origins of the book? When was it written? Who was the author? What's the context it was written in? And then they're going to go verse by verse and look at each verse and discuss. First of all, they're going to discuss linguistic issues. So any odd meanings or problems with translations that may occur in that verse, be it Hebrew or Greek, for if it's a New Testament. Okay. And then, again, depending on the faith commitments of the author behind it, there will be a section that maybe what's the meaning of this passage from the text, and then there may be what's the devotional application. So, but if it's strictly, strictly just a scholarly commentary, they may just stick with the meaning, right? It's not so important, or maybe it's a totally different subject. What's the application to a believer?
Okay, so what's special about this John Collins guy?
Well, John Collins is a professor of, I don't know, what's his title exactly? Old Testament Criticism and Interpretation at Yale Divinity School.
Okay.
So he's probably one of, if not the foremost expert on the Hebrew Bible. I mean, he's a top name. And so he is looking at this hardcore, scholarly sort of approach.
Now, does he have any sort of religious background?
As I understand it, he grew up Catholic. I mean, originally he's Irish. He's been in the U.S. forever. I don't know. He's Irish American. I don't know his status there, but I think he grew up Catholic. But that's unclear to me.
Okay.
So,
well, cool. So, what does he say about the?
Well,
I'm super curious on where he stands in terms of authorship and dating. In
well, I mean, he's representing, I think, the scholarly consensus in all of these things. So, in terms of author, the authorship of Daniel is hotly contested. Mm-hmm. But in general, the scholarly consensus is. It's a compilation of several streams of tradition that were put together by an editor or editors, and its authorship. It claims to be written by Daniel, but that is a pseudonym. Mm-hmm. So there probably was no Daniel, and the name was chosen because there's really pretty clear evidence that there were traditions of a wise man, a prophet named Daniel, mm-hmm. and so this figure was chosen to be the author by whoever penned the sort of the introduction and this. Of it. So that's actually a very common. It sounds weird to us today. Why would you write under a pseudonym? But that's a common strategy in Second Temple Jewish writings.
So then would you say that the author of Daniel, whoever it may be, is a prophet?
Well,
does it work that way?
I don't know if I would say so. It's complicated,
yeah, because
there are two sections to Daniel, generally speaking. So the first section is a series of six tales about Daniel and what happens to him and his colleagues, if you will. There's got to be a better word than that, in Babylon, ancient Babylon.
Yep.
And then the second half of the book are visions that Daniel is supposed to have had. And so these are the differing traditions that are the origins. There are different origins for these different streams of tradition. And then later they were put together. Is it prophet? I mean, you'd have to. I don't know that it's considered prophet. It is the second half with the visions is considered apocalyptic, mm-hmm. and that has a very technical meaning among scholars. It's a whole genre of literature. Mm-hmm. Just like there's all different kinds of genres. There's crime fiction. There's fantasy, whatever. Mm-hmm. So the genres of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, are different than the genres we have today. So, for example, they don't have crime fiction, right? Mm-hmm. But they do have apocalypse, and we don't have apocalypse, right? Sometimes I think I should write an apocalypse to illustrate what apocalypse is, but they don't have apocalypse.
I just feel like you could come up with a nice apocalypse, and it's going to happen in education soon.
Well,
if it's not already happening.
Yeah,
I think we're in the apocalypse. We're definitely in tribulation period, right? In education. There's got to be tribulation period.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah. So an apocalypse is pseudonymous writing, right? So it claims to be written by somebody well known to the readers. Now, this is not an attempt to fool people or put one over. It is merely an attempt to claim importance, right? This is an important thing, and you can see that because I am using the name of this famous, important, holy figure, right? So Apocalypse is this person has a vision that's almost always, if not always, mediated by an angelic or spiritual figure. And then this angelic intermediary later explains the meaning of the vision. Now, the visions also have an element of what, the technical term is ex eventu prophecy. Okay. So what that means is prophecy after the fact. So they claim to have visions that tell the future, but they were written after the events. Right. So what that means is what the author is doing, the author of an apocalypse is doing, is explaining recent events, maybe even current events, in a spiritual manner, trying to give a spiritual explanation for events that have occurred. Yeah. And typically, apocalypse seem to have occurred under times of pressure, right? So oppression, persecution, this sort of thing. And so the focal point upon the spiritual elements serves as a warning and as an encouragement to the readers. So the warning is, the world is problematic and it is influenced by these evil spiritual forces. But hang on, this is the encouragement, hang on, because the future is guided and controlled by God. And at the end, the world will be reversed. The situation will be flipped upside down, and the righteous will rule at the end. And they often have an element of the righteous being vindicated through resurrection. So there'll be a resurrection at the end, and this is a salvation for people. So this is sort of the technical, official sort of description of the genre of apocalypse. Now, you see, we don't have that today.
Right. Now, of course, the traditional view of Daniel is that Daniel is actually writing. Right. The dating is much earlier, right. And these are prophecy in the sense that most laymen understand prophecy, which is future prediction.
Right. Yeah. So, and I have to say, there's a lot of scholars who, and these are typically in, religious seminaries that hold to this traditional interpretation. That they're actually, and some of whom, I really respect, the ones I know, right, I respect. They hold that Daniel was the actual author. Yeah, as you say, the dating was early. We haven't really talked about dating, but typically the critical scholarship, and by critical, I don't mean that they are criticizing it. I mean that they're looking at the text critically in terms of dating and these sorts of things, maybe as opposed to devotionally.
Sure.
And so the traditional thinking towards Daniel is written by Daniel. Daniel was a real historical figure. These events describe the first half of the book describe his life. The second half of the book are visions he actually had.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
and since he was supposed to be an inhabitant of Babylon, they would be much earlier, 6th century BC.
So why the shift from the traditional dating?
Well, it has a lot. So there are different reasons why scholars think that Daniel is actually written way later than the Babylonian Empire. And some of them are linguistic. So, it's in Aramaic and it's in Hebrew, and the Aramaic is generally considered imperial Aramaic, which is towards the later period of Aramaic writing. So I think 5 to 300 BC, I think, is the dating. So the Aramaic seems to be late, and usually I think the scholarship holds that it was towards sort of the latter part of that period, so closer to 200, 300 BC, right? Which is long after the Babylonian Empire. The Hebrew itself is also categorized as late biblical Hebrew, so these are mostly texts that post-date the exile, right? So the Jews are taken into exile. And it has more similarities to the Dead Sea Scrolls than it does to sort of the classical Hebrew of the earlier passages of the Bible. So, and this all boils down to, languages change over time.
Yeah.
So, that's very clear. If somebody reads the King James Bible, right, it has different forms of the language, verbs and nouns or whatever, than we do today. So what Hebrew scholars and Aramaic scholars do is they look at the language and they look at the way the types of verbs they use, the types of noun phrases they use, these sorts of things, and they fit it, see where it is. Just like, if you hear, I don't know, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou? That wasn't written yesterday, right? That was written, 500 years, whatever, 600 years ago.
So that's interesting. It actually got me thinking. I've never really actually thought about this, but one explanation, of course, is that these things are written later because of these linguistic things.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons I think we can date things in terms of like modern writing, how our translations of Scripture now. I mean, the New King James, for example, is just an updated King James.
Yeah.
One explanation could be that these were visions of Daniel. These were actual visions of Daniel. Original writing was from Daniel. And those copies have simply been lost to time, but it was passed down, and maybe the language was updated by scribes later to modern.
I mean, I suppose it's possible. I don't recall.
I've never thought about that before. It was literally just as you were talking, I was thinking about our own modern translations. And like, we have older English that gets updated to newer English. So if like 1611 King James no longer existed, then we would, of course, and then thinking back, like if everything ceased, everything stops printing, we lose all of the older English versions of the Bible, and then 1,000 years from now, somebody who speaks, New English 1,000 years from now looks back and they're dating the NIV. They're, of course, not going to play. They're going to place it, in our time period, I guess.
Yeah.
But that's just. I mean, it's well, okay. A better example would be New King James, since there's the earlier
So what you're
version of
saying
King
is
James.
it could have earlier origins. It was updated by later scribes.
Yeah.
So I mean, I suppose it's possible. I don't recall Collins discussing that. I mean, it's a big book, and I suppose that's possible.
Yeah.
To me, and I know a little bit about historical linguistics, having studied it some many years ago.
You've had a lot of background in linguistics, I think.
So, and some of it is, it's not a hard and fast science, right? So there's some wiggle room either way. The Aramaic, from what I gather, the debate over the date of the Aramaic is kind of if you can go either way. The Hebrew seems more clear cut, just from what I've read. But to me, what really dates it later is the form it takes. This genre of apocalyptic, and scholars seem to agree that it's the earliest type of apocalyptic we have. But still, that's not something that happens until much, much later. So like some of the stuff found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this kind of stuff later. So that seems to me date it much later. And they think that the apocalyptic probably has its origins, the visions of Zechariah or Ezekiel. They're not apocalyptic, but they are sort of visions. Now, one thing I thought was interesting is if you think about apocalyptic, if it is this literary style, and Collins talks about this just briefly, and I thought it was really interesting. It could be a sheer act of the imagination, right? Now, if you're a Christian, as we are, right, I believe it was a divinely inspired act of the imagination, a divinely inspired bit of literature. So it could be that, but it doesn't preclude the fact that there were actually they reflect some sort of experience, which personally I had always just assumed it is automatically an act of the imagination. Either one, I think, is acceptable from an Orthodox Christian viewpoint. You just have to understand that the purpose of the author is to give a spiritual interpretation and encouragement, exhortation to its audience.
And I think this is probably one of the more important distinctions. Like, most people view Daniel and parts of Isaiah, for example, as prophecy in terms of future prediction.
Right.
But that's not necessarily the scholarly view of prophecy. No. Prophecy is not always future prediction. In fact, the majority of the time, prophecy, I think, is this sort of spiritual interpretation of events during or after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak about Isaiah because I haven't really studied it much.
Yeah.
But in Daniel and apocalyptic literature, it's definitely this ex eventu prophecy. It's after the fact, but you can there's spiritual edification that occur when you realize this is the spiritual interpretation of events. That's very applicable to a believer's life.
Okay.
Now, the first half of the book is these stories about Daniel. So, again, a scholarly interpretation of those that's a different genre of literature, something that has been labeled court tales. And this is so, by the way, apocalypse, in terms of what apocalyptic books we have, the ones that most Christians are going to be aware of are, of course, Daniel and the book of Revelations, which is an apocalypse.
Right.
But there are a whole bunch of others. There's a so-called animal apocalypse, in which historical figures take the form of animals. There's several, probably a dozen or so different apocalypses. Let's see if I can find a decent list of them in my notes here. And I think, here's a minimal list. First Enoch, the second apocalypse of Baruch, 4 Ezra, the apocalypse of Abraham, the book of Revelations, of course. Daniel, of course, is one. Second Enoch, third apocalypse of Baruch, the apocalypse of Peter. So there's a whole bunch. That's a minimal list. There's more than that. So this is, it might shock.
Now, it's interesting which ones here you guys think are included in the canon of Scripture and which are...
Yeah, I mean, Daniel and the book of Revelations.
And that's it.
That's right. Yeah. So the rest are not. But it shows you that these two books fit in with this really well-known style of writing.
Right.
Yeah. So that, to me, is what really indicates this later writing. I mean, the Hebrew, to hear Collins describe it, the Hebrew evidence seems pretty clear cut that it's a later Hebrew.
Yeah.
Like I say, the Aramaic is more debatable. So that's the apocalypse, right? The apocalypse half, which is, I guess 7 on. And then you have the first half of the book are these tales about Daniel in the lion's den, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these stories. And so the contention is, by the critical scholarly opinion, that these are a part of a genre known as court tales that happen There's tons of these throughout the Near East. And these have to do with an advisor to the king or some chamberlain or some such in the high court. And they have some sort of misadventure, if you will, some sort of crisis, and then that gets solved.
Okay.
And so all of these early stories about Daniel, according to the critical scholarship, these are, again, sort of part of this literature that tell about an official, Daniel, who has, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has these this adventure, I don't know if that's the right word, but crisis at the court, and then there is a final resolution. Now, what makes Daniel unique among the others is the crisis is always religious in nature, and the solution is, of course, God. So, that being the case, if you would say that these are, this is a particular genre of literature, you can still hold that it's divinely inspired, right? With a purpose of teaching and instructing, and has truth. And essentially, if you think that Daniel was an actual figure who went through these things, or it's the work of literature, the lessons are really the same.
Okay. So is that kind of Colin's main point?
Well, I mean, his main point is just to communicate the scholarly literature regarding Daniel. Right?
Gotcha.
So you take from it what you will.
So for our purposes, the point is there's a little wiggle room here. You don't have to be so strict on your idea of Daniel actually existing,
right,
and all of this. We can. We have some wiggle room here.
There's no contradiction between Christian belief and the historicity of Daniel, right? So yeah, there's no contradiction at all.
Okay. Well, is there any sort of key points from Collins that we should?
Well, there is one other thing that he talks about that I actually looked at some detail here, and that Daniel is the place that introduces the Son of Man concept.
Yeah.
Right? So
favorite title of Jesus.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So
now the interesting thing is Collins argues, and obviously he's not alone, that the Son of Man title in Daniel, the original author of Daniel, used the Son of Man to depict this figure on the clouds, one like a Son of Man, just to mean one like a human being. So the figure is this exalted figure, but the term Son of Man meant only he was like a human being, in form. But what's interesting is other books written, slightly later, particularly the Similitudes of Enoch, describes a Son of Man figure. And in that figure, he is equated with Messiah and sort of a divine figure. For Enoch, that's another one of these apocalypses we talked about, has him as this pre-existent figure. In other words, he was existent before creation. He was a supernatural figure. So they seem to have been affected by Daniel in his depiction, and then they interpreted it as a divine figure, pre-existent and supernatural. And so that is what is interesting about that is that's sort of the intellectual, theological mix from which Jesus drew the idea of Son of Man. And when he applied it to himself, now I haven't done a significant study of this, but I'm hoping to very soon. There's a new book out that we'll discuss hopefully soon. That goes into great detail about this, but I think that's the mix from which Jesus is using to apply to himself, right? He's this pre-existent, supernatural, messianic figure.
So I think, so Enoch is a Second Temple Jewish writing.
For Ezra too.
So the idea is the theological significance around the title Son of Man this is something that would have been well understood. So when Jesus used that title, Son of Man, there was a specific understanding of that. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Now, that may not be the figure in the exact meaning in Daniel.
Right.
So Daniel seems to only mean like
Just
a human
looking like
being.
a human,
Right,
yeah.
right. But very quickly that gets expanded upon.
Yes.
And so that it takes on all this more meaning. And Jesus is tapping into that meaning.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. So.
Well, good. I think that's Colin seems an interesting read.
Oh yeah,
Sure.
it was really good. I enjoyed it. So
Good. Well, what do we have next time? Do we know?
well, next time we might be talking about another interesting book, secret gospel of Mark.
The Secret Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, fun.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. All right.
All right.
Well, I guess until next time.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching TACTCast, a production of the Tennessee Academy of Christian Thought. Be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. Make sure to follow us over on our social medias. Links in the description. Thanks for watching.